Hey there, welcome to The Last Records. In this video, we will be going into moments where Karens meet their worst end. From a Karen dangling 60 feet up on her custom-made safety harness to another, carrying a cinder block to smash her neighbor's window, ending the night with a useless 911 call.
It was March 14th, 2018, and the morning mist was just starting to burn off above a canopy tour operation set into the side of a forested ridge outside a small city in Colombia's coffee region, where a wooden platform roughly 60 feet above the valley floor served as the launch point for a series of cables strung between the trees. Chelsea Hargrove was 38 years old and worked as a real estate agent in Scottsdale, Arizona. She was on a vacation with two girlfriends, a week-long trip they had been planning for months, and the canopy tour was supposed to be the highlight of the whole trip. Her friends later said Chelsea was the type of person who sent food back at basically every restaurant they went to, not because there was anything actually wrong with it, but because she always found something. One friend described a dinner the year before where Chelsea literally made the waiter come back 4 times over the temperature of a steak and then left a 1-star review before they even made it to the car. On this particular morning, she had already complained about the shuttle van being too warm on the drive up, sent her lunch plate back at the lodge because the rice was undercooked, and gotten into it with a staff member about the fit of her helmet before they even reached the first platform. The harness was just the next thing on the list, and honestly, that's the biggest thing that's been bothering me this whole time, because for her, this wasn't just some unusual moment, it was just another day of complaints, and the complaint this time just happened to be the wrong one. The canopy operation used a commercial zipline harness system with adjustable waist and leg straps designed to keep riders securely positioned during the crossing. Before each rider launched, an operator on the platform checked the fit and tightened everything to the correct tension. When Chelsea's turn came, she pretty much immediately told the operator the waist strap was digging into her hips and she wanted it loosened. The operator, a local man in his 20s who had worked the platforms for 3 seasons, explained in limited English that the harness needed to be snug for safety. Chelsea told him it was too tight and she wasn't going anywhere until he fixed it. Her friend said she basically got louder, brought up leaving a review, and made sure he knew she wasn't messing around. The operator gave in and loosened the waist strap, and then he loosened the upper leg straps too, after she said those were also pinching. Like, tell me how in the world you're supposed to say no to someone like that when she's standing on your platform refusing to move until she gets what she wants. She launched from the platform on the longest cable span of the course, roughly 400 feet across a valley gap, with the ground 60 feet below. About halfway across, her body started shifting down in the loosened harness. Like the straps that were supposed to keep her in place just had too much slack, and her hips and thighs kinda slid right through. Her weight dropped below the attachment point. She slid out of the harness feet first. Witnesses on the opposite platform saw her separate from the harness and fall. The drop was roughly 60 feet onto a mix of exposed rock and dense undergrowth on the valley slope below. There was no sound from the group on either platform for several seconds. 2 guides descended by rope from the nearest platform. She was found unresponsive in the brush roughly 30 feet below the cable line. They radioed for help, but the rescue crews had to get there on foot through the terrain, and it took them like 45 minutes. She was pronounced dead on scene. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be catastrophic blunt force trauma from a fall at height, with multiple fractures to the skull, spine, and pelvis. The loosened waist and leg straps were documented as the primary contributing factor. I can't get it out of my head that the exact adjustment she demanded is what let her fall, and nobody on that platform could talk her out of it because she'd already made up her mind. The investigation cleared the operator, noting that he had adjusted the harness under pressure from the client after repeated demands. The canopy company implemented dual operator fit verification procedures and added secondary retention checks before each launch. Chelsea's friends gave their statements and flew home to Arizona. The social media post they took on the platform like 10 minutes before the launch ended up in the incident file. It was December 23, 2016 in Los Angeles. Terminal 4 was operating under peak holiday congestion, with delayed arrivals and heavy baggage loads creating sustained operational strain, though systems remained functional. Melissa Grant was a 44-year-old, former collegiate runner, now a corporate logistics consultant after a career-ending injury. She traveled frequently for airline efficiency and supply chain work and was highly structured, but increasingly impatient with transit delays, often viewing routine congestion as procedural failure rather than normal operation. operations. Baggage handling used automated conveyor systems beneath passenger floors, with restricted service corridors, rotating rollers, and timed sorting cycles. Access was strictly prohibited due to mechanical hazards, with safety maintained through barriers, signage, and staff enforcement rather than immediate shutdown capability. Her flight got in late, so she already had a pretty tight connection. On top of that, her luggage was delayed because of a system backlog, and even though staff told her it would come out in batches, she stayed at the carousel anyway, kind of pressing them for it to come faster, while other passengers were already picking up their bags. I've definitely seen people staring at the same empty carousel like it'll make the bags appear sooner. As delays continued, she repeatedly questioned baggage handling procedures and requested manual retrieval. Staff issued multiple verbal warnings, but she intermittently left the designated claim zone and approached service boundaries on several occasions despite being directed back. During a brief lull between baggage cycles, she misread nearby signage and maintenance notices as an alternative retrieval route and crossed a flexible barrier into a restricted service corridor despite staff calling out to stop her. She continued forward without stopping or rechecking, focused entirely on getting to her luggage, in that narrow, almost automatic state where I'd just keep going without second guessing anything. This placed her beyond a restricted service barrier into an operational maintenance corridor accessed via a service entry point adjacent to the conveyor system. Staff immediately attempted to redirect her, but she continued forward, attempting to locate her luggage within the operational zone. A new baggage batch entered moments later, reactivating full movement through the section she had entered. She moved closer to the belt interface, now within the active conveyor envelope, as her footing became unstable on the narrow, shifting walkway. She became caught at a transfer point between a moving belt and adjacent drive rollers, where pinch point forces drew her forward into the machinery. Her clothing and body were pulled into the roller interface, resulting in severe compressive and shear injuries consistent with conveyor entrapment. The conveyor was shut down within seconds via emergency stop activation, but severe compressive injuries had already occurred during the entrapment at the active roller transfer point before full stoppage. Staff extracted her once motion stopped, and emergency medical teams were dispatched directly into the baggage handling area through service corridors. Response time was recorded at under 6 minutes from the initial alarm. It happened fast, but not fast enough to undo what had already been done. She was rushed to a nearby trauma center in critical condition. Later medical reports said she had severe crush injuries from getting caught in the conveyor system, including major internal injuries, torn blood vessels, and other compression-related damage that likely happened before the system was fully shut down. Investigators confirmed all conveyor H systems operated as designed and emergency stops functioned correctly, with no mechanical failure found. The restricted area was off-limits, with safety dependent on strict separation between public and operational zones. The investigation concluded that repeated disregard of staff warnings and entry into a restricted operational area led to the incident. Following the incident, the airport reinforced barriers around conveyor access points, improved signage visibility, and added additional safety cutoffs near service corridors. Airline training materials were also updated to address escalation behavior in baggage claim areas during high-volume travel periods, emphasizing strict adherence to operational boundaries. It was March 22, 2017, on a residential street in Akron, Ohio. That morning, one decision made in the dark in front of a legally parked truck ended a woman's life before most of her neighbors had finished sleeping. Alora James Finch was 58 and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small local office, reliable enough that her employer trusted her with payroll reconciliation for nearly a decade. However, neighbors described her as strongly opinionated about what belonged on her block. She had filed multiple complaints with the city regarding a contractor's pickup truck that had parked legally outside her home for several weeks. The truck was registered, insured, and within every applicable ordinance. Every complaint returned the same result: no violation found. By mid-March, the formal channels had closed. Evidence later suggested she continued monitoring the truck for at least 2 more weeks, including a security light she had repositioned toward the curb. Whatever her calculation, she had arrived at a conclusion. If the city wouldn't act, she would. I think most people understand the frustration of being dismissed by institutions. What's harder to account for is the distance between that frustration and a kitchen knife before dawn. She retrieved a small paring knife and left her home at approximately 4:40 a.m. Footage from her property camera and a neighbor's device recorded her crossing the lawn in dark clothing, crouching beside the rear driver's side tire of the pickup, and pressing the blade into the sidewall near the lower tread. The footage does not show hesitation. It does not show uncertainty. You could see that it shows a woman who had already decided. It shows someone carrying out a decision she had made before she ever stepped outside. A motion-activated light above a garage across the road had already switched off, leaving the area darker and less visible than it had been moments earlier. The only sound captured on a nearby security camera equipped with a microphone was the faint scrape of the blade working against the rubber sidewall, repeating in a steady, subdued rhythm as it made contact. After several seconds of cutting, the sidewall tore. The tire released its air almost instantly. What followed wasn't a hiss, it was a percussive crack, sharp and flat, like something struck hard with a palm, but heavier. A resident 3 houses north later told investigators the sound pulled her from sleep. Alora was crouched roughly 12 inches from the sidewall when it released. The footage shows her jerking backward in surprise, arms wide, losing footing on the frost-slicked asphalt. She stepped directly into the roadway. It's crazy to think that the footage captured it in under 2 seconds, the startled reaction, the stumble, and then she was in the lane. A sedan traveling eastbound within the posted 25-mile-per-hour limit had already rounded the bend approximately 80 feet out when she entered the lane. The driver braked immediately. Investigators confirmed that through camera footage, vehicle data, and physical evidence at the scene, but stopping distance at that speed on a cold road was not sufficient. The braking began as soon as the hazard became visible, with full force applied, but the vehicle still couldn't decelerate in time given the short distance and road conditions. The driver had reacted as soon as Alora became visible, but there simply was not enough distance available to avoid a collision. Even under maximum braking, the gap was too small to compensate. The impact was front driver's side, occurring in the immediate path of travel. Alora was thrown forward and came down on the road surface approximately 15 feet from the point of contact. The force of the collision carried her beyond the vehicle's path before she struck the pavement. She did not move after that. The sedan driver called emergency services immediately, but they could only pronounce Alora dead at the scene. First responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do for her. The coroner's findings identified the cause of death as massive blunt force trauma to the head and torso, consistent with a pedestrian struck by a motor vehicle at moderate speed, with additional injuries from road surface contact. The injuries were catastrophic and incompatible with survival. Local coverage lasted 1 day. The contractor whose truck was the subject of every complaint was not identified publicly. Investigators reconstructed the full sequence using footage from multiple cameras without ambiguity. The driver faced no charges. The part that stays with me is that the truck was never illegally parked. Not once, not by any standard that existed.
It was May 3rd, 2019, when early evening light filtered through the windows of a small restaurant in a coastal village south of Naples. The dining room held 8 tables with checkered cloth, and the smell of garlic and tomato drifted from a narrow kitchen. Devin Pritchard was 47 years old and worked as a civil litigation attorney in Denver. She had traveled to Italy with her sister for a 10-day tour and was described as confrontational, often relying on legal threats when challenged. The family-owned restaurant specialized in fresh seafood. Devin had a documented severe shellfish allergy and carried a prescribed epinephrine auto-injector. After being seated, Devin questioned the server about cross-contamination risks. The server explained the kitchen was small, with shared equipment, and could not guarantee safety. Devin ordered a shrimp pasta without shrimp and refused alternative dishes. When told safety could not be assured, she demanded the owner and threatened complaints under European disability regulations. After further consultation, the server returned and said the dish would be prepared only if Devin signed a written acknowledgement confirming she had been warned and was ordering against recommendation. Devin signed without reading carefully. The dish arrived about 20 minutes later. Devin ate roughly half. She soon mentioned that her throat felt strange, but dismissed concern, attributing it to wine. Within minutes, her voice became strained, and she repeatedly touched her neck. Redness spread across her face and neck. She stood and said she needed air. When asked about her epinephrine injector, she said it was in her purse. By the time her sister retrieved it outside, Devin was leaning against the exterior wall, breathing rapidly with audible wheezing and visible facial swelling. Her sister administered the auto-injector. Devin's condition worsened, She collapsed onto the cobblestone street as the restaurant owner called emergency services. Bystanders kept her on her side while monitoring breathing. Emergency responders arrived approximately 14 minutes later. They found Devon unresponsive with severe airway swelling and initiated advanced airway management before transporting her under resuscitation to a hospital roughly 30 minutes away. Despite aggressive treatment, including epinephrine, antihistamines, and mechanical ventilation, Devon suffered cardiac arrest from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Resuscitation continued for over 40 minutes without success. She was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours after ingestion. Post-mortem examination determined that death resulted from anaphylactic shock due to shellfish protein exposure, with respiratory failure leading to cardiac arrest. Laboratory analysis confirmed trace shrimp protein consistent with cross-contamination. Italian authorities determined the restaurant followed appropriate protocols by providing warnings and obtaining written acknowledgement. No charges were filed.
It was October 12, 2019, at a restricted spillway area in California. The sky was overcast and flat, casting even light across the concrete structure and the water below. Lyrian Dawson was 36 years old, a part-time barista in Sonora, and a freelance landscape photographer with a growing social media presence built on Sierra Nevada imagery. In pursuit of more extreme compositions, she increasingly sought locations beyond marked access points. While technically skilled, she had no formal training in structural environments, no safety instruction for restricted infrastructure, and no experience with industrial water control sites. She arrived alone at the spillway and went past clearly posted warnings and fencing marking the area as restricted due to steep concrete and hazardous water conditions. After slipping through a lowered section of barrier, staff on site told her directly to leave. She acknowledged them but brushed it off, saying she just needed a few photos, and kept going onto the spillway apron while leaving her gear outside the restricted zone.
I'm not sure people even realize how violent that shift is, from sliding on concrete to hitting water. It's a hard impact, not a soft landing.
The spillway itself was a steep concrete chute built for high-speed water release. Even when it wasn't actively flowing, the surface could still have a thin layer of algae and mineral buildup, and the smooth concrete made it extremely slippery. She stayed near the upper section for a few minutes, taking photos, looking down, and slowly edging closer to the slope as she worked, gradually moving toward the point where the flat top dropped into the steep apron. At a late morning moment during her positioning along the spillway edge, her footing failed on the algae-coated surface. Traction failed suddenly, with no usable grip or recovery point available. She slipped onto the steep concrete face and rapidly accelerated downslope under gravity across the 65-foot spillway. Reduced friction on the surface resulted in a rapid, uncontrolled slide. I can tell once she hits that algae-slick concrete, there's basically no way to recover it.
She struck the stilling basin at the base of the spillway at high velocity and immediately entered the turbulent outflow water.
The impact forces from the descent and collision were catastrophic, producing severe blunt force trauma to multiple regions of the body before submersion. The camera, still attached by a neck strap, was torn free during the fall and recovered outside the spillway zone. Witnesses downstream reported a brief cry followed by silence. Emergency services were alerted after her equipment was found outside the restricted perimeter and no one was visible at the spillway crest. Rescue teams later recovered her body after it was carried beyond the immediate basin into downstream flow. I always find it unsettling how fast she was here turns into she's gone in reports like this. A forensic examination found fatal blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed impact on reinforced concrete, including severe chest and head injuries with multiple fractures and catastrophic internal trauma. Water in the lungs indicated she was alive upon entry into the basin, though the injuries were immediately non-survivable. Her camera contained a sequence of images leading up to the fall, ending with a downward shot along the spillway. Her social media account remained active for months afterward, and her photography circulated online, detached from the circumstances of her death. Her equipment was later donated to a school photography program without disclosure of its origin. It was June 14, 2017, in Barcelona, Spain. The afternoon inside a maritime heritage archive unfolded under controlled lighting with steady visitor flow and normal operations. The visitor was a 38-year-old American woman named Lauren Mitchell, traveling through Europe on a structured cultural tour tied to an educational program and a commercial photography sponsorship. She frequently documented travel experiences for online audiences and was vocal about getting the shot she paid for, often treating group pacing and staff instructions as flexible rather than fixed. The archive had ship components hanging above a reinforced floor, with maintenance channels hidden underneath some sections. Honestly, I'd probably be looking up the whole time in a place like that. Some of those old ship pieces are huge. Visitors were required to stay on the marked walkways, and staff would warn that leaning over the edges or stepping off the path could actually put them near restricted structural areas. As the group entered the main hall, Lauren moved ahead of others and continued filming despite requests to remain within the designated group line. When staff reminded her that a scheduled maintenance window was affecting adjacent operational zones, she dismissed the warning, saying she needed uninterrupted footage for sponsored documentation and that delays would compromise her recording. She barely acknowledged it, treating the warning like another inconvenience standing between her and the shot she wanted. Her movement repeatedly drifted toward walkway edges as she prioritized low-angle shots of the suspended exhibits. Staff attempted further redirection to keep her within the central path, but she only briefly complied before returning forward once attention shifted.
Over time, her position began overlapping areas flagged for temporary coordination with the connected dockside maintenance system beneath the structure.
By most visitors, lower service levels were conducting scheduled maintenance in adjacent subfloor corridors. A recently serviced section near the exhibit edge was still undergoing final checks, with temporary barriers being repositioned as staff managed visitor flow. Fixed lighting and floor markings indicated the primary route, and staff continued directing visitors away from transitional areas. Lauren stepped into a gap in crowd movement and positioned herself near a transitional floor zone bordering a recently serviced area. While adjusting her camera for a low-angle shot, she moved beyond the marked walkway and into the restricted section before staff could redirect her. The access panel had recently been reinstalled after inspection work and remained under temporary locking hardware while final verification checks were being completed. As she stepped onto the panel from outside the designated load-bearing path, the unsecured section shifted beneath her, opening a gap into the maintenance space below. The impact caused catastrophic blunt force trauma, including suspected head and torso injuries with rapid neurological compromise. Responders found her unconscious and in critical condition, and despite immediate transport and resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to severe internal injuries and traumatic hemorrhage. Investigators confirmed all systems functioned as designed, including walkway supports and monitoring equipment. The maintenance channel was not intended for public access, and its cover panel was rated only for static distributed load, not transitional pressure during synchronized operational activity. The investigation identified multiple contributing factors, including unauthorized entry into a restricted transition area containing a recently serviced access panel and repeated disregard of staff advisories, with photography activity noted as a distraction that reduced situational awareness. No single mechanical fault was identified as the sole cause of the incident. No personal footage was released or circulated, and internal recordings remained restricted, with officials confirming that no verified visual documentation exists publicly. Following the review, coordination protocols and floor edge indicators were strengthened to better separate visitor pathways from active maintenance zones. I thought I was still within the boundaries that mattered. It was August 22nd, 2019, and a 12-seat tour bus climbed a gravel switchback road above the tree line in the Bolivian Altiplano, where the air was thin enough to feel in your chest with every breath, and the brown and gold landscape stretched flat to the horizon under a sky so blue it almost looked fake. Bryn McAllister was 41 years old and owned a boutique fitness studio in Calgary, Canada, the kind with branded water bottles and motivational slogans on the walls. She was lean, disciplined, and very publicly fit, the type of person whose whole identity was pretty much built around her body. Tour group members said Bryn told basically everyone at the airport that she was training for her third marathon. And on the bus ride to the first hotel, she asked the guide how many of the group were in decent shape, and then answered her own question by listing her resting heart rate and weekly running mileage like it was a resume. When several members of the group took altitude medication they had brought for the trip, Bryn waved it off and said she didn't put chemicals in her body. 2 other group members accepted their tablets quietly. She made sure everyone knew she was the one person who didn't need them. She didn't just say no, she made a whole production out of it, so every person in that van knew she was above needing help, And in my experience, that kind of confidence only ever goes one direction. Day 1, at roughly 11,000 feet, she was fine, energetic, talkative, no visible symptoms. She did a short hike with the group that afternoon and was honestly near the front the whole time, though that night she mentioned that she hadn't slept great and felt kind of nauseous, which she blamed on the food, of course. The group went higher on day 2, got to just over 13,000 feet by late morning. By early afternoon, Bryn had this headache she brought up once and then kinda just stopped mentioning. She also looked slightly unsteady during a stop at a viewpoint, leaning against the railing in a way another traveler noticed. By late afternoon, she had slowed considerably on a short walk from the bus to a lookout, stopping twice to catch her breath on what was basically flat ground. The guide checked on her and she said she was just tired from the altitude and would be fine after some rest. She didn't come down for dinner. The guide went to check on her room like 30 minutes after dinner and found her just sitting on the edge of her bed, clearly confused and honestly not able to answer even simple questions. Her coordination was poor, her speech was slurred, and she couldn't follow simple instructions to stand or walk toward the door. When the guide asked her to squeeze his hand, she didn't seem to understand the request. He pretty much knew right away what was happening and called emergency services. She was transported by ambulance to a lower altitude hospital roughly 2 hours away. By the time she arrived, the swelling in her brain had progressed significantly despite emergency treatment and descent to lower altitude. She was placed on oxygen and monitored through the night, but her condition kept deteriorating. She never regained full consciousness. She died the following morning. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, which is basically when your brain swells from lack of oxygen at elevation, and once it gets past a certain point, even getting to lower ground can't reverse the damage. Investigators noted the guide had recommended altitude medication during the pre-trip briefing, which she declined, and that early symptoms were present on day 2, but she didn't report them until it was too late. The guide's documentation of her refusal and her stated reason were included in the incident file. The tour company expanded its altitude screening procedures and strengthened pre-trip medical briefings for high-altitude routes. Her fitness studio put up a short memorial on social media, and honestly, her marathon training page was still live months later. It was July 19, 2014, on a residential block in Plano, Texas. The afternoon was quiet. A few neighbors were outside doing routine weekend chores, and a group of middle school boys rode their bikes along the street as sprinklers dried beneath the summer sun. Maris Cuomo was 52, retired from a mid-size insurance brokerage after nearly 2 decades processing claims. She owned a well-kept single-story home with a front lawn she maintained carefully. In 1998, her only son had drowned in a neighbor's unfenced pool 3 blocks away. No charges were ever filed. What that produced over the following 16 years was visible: a reaction to children near her property that bypassed reason entirely. That afternoon, a group of middle school boys cut across the strip of grass between her curb and sidewalk on bikes. Maris came out within seconds, phone raised and already recording for the HOA. One boy stopped near the curb instead of riding off, and that was enough. She moved toward the side of the house where a garden hose was coiled and began unspooling it toward him. I think the documentation angle tells you everything about how she had learned to manage this, routing grief into procedure, into process, into whatever kept it from becoming something else. Days earlier, a lawnmower had clipped a heavy-duty outdoor extension cord running through the grass that powered a decorative pond pump near the side of the property. The damaged section, a split in the insulation several inches long, had settled back into the wet grass and gone unnoticed. Before she came outside, Maris had plugged the cord back into an aging exterior outlet whose ground fault protection had failed and was never replaced. The damaged section remained energized in the damp grass throughout the day. The sprinklers had soaked the grass that morning. 3 neighbors were outside. One was washing a car 2 houses down, one was walking toward her mailbox, one stood in an open garage. All 3 gave statements later. The air was completely still. You know that midday suburban quiet, the kind where you can hear a car door shut from half a block away? The exposed conductor had already created a dangerous voltage gradient in the surrounding wet soil and grass.
As Maris stepped into the saturated area while pulling the hose across the lawn, one foot entered the energized section before the other. Current passed through her body, disrupting her heart rhythm almost instantly.
The entire sequence began the moment she crossed into the affected area. There was no visible warning and no obvious indication of what had happened. The woman near the mailbox said Maris went rigid, arms locked. body upright for what she estimated as 2 to 3 seconds. The man in the garage said it looked like she had simply tripped because there was no visible cause. From a distance, nothing about the collapse immediately suggested electrocution. She fell forward into the grass and made no attempt to catch herself. There was no shout or call for help. The neighbor washing the car dropped what he was holding and crossed toward her lawn. He recognized immediately he couldn't touch her. He retrieved a long-handled wooden broom from his garage and used it to pull the cord free from the outlet, then began CPR. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late for Maris. She was pronounced dead at the hospital from cardiac arrhythmia caused by electrocution. Her funeral was attended by former co-workers and a small number of neighbors. The arrangements were simple and organized. The failed outlet and the clipped cord were cited in the incident report. Investigators also recovered the phone she had been using to record and documented the footage as part of the scene. They also spoke with the boys she had come outside to confront, determining that none had played any role in the incident. Nobody on the street had known the protection had stopped working. I think the 1998 drowning is the actual beginning of this story. Everything that followed, the documentation habit, the hose, the cord nobody thought to check, was just the shape that unresolved grief takes when it's never given anywhere useful to go.
It was January 6th, 2020, when late morning sun warmed white sand on a Queensland beach in northern Australia. The temperature approached 95 degrees. Turquoise water stretched toward a barrier reef, visible miles offshore. About 30 beachgoers gathered near a patrolled swimming zone marked by red and yellow flags. Kendrix Valance was 39 years old and worked as a personal fitness trainer in Seattle, operating a small studio. She was vacationing in Australia with her boyfriend, who later described her as supremely confident in her physical abilities and dismissive of safety warnings she viewed as exaggerated. They arrived around 10:30 at a beach monitored by volunteer surf lifesavers. Large signs at the entrance and patrol station warned that marine stingers were present due to seasonal conditions and that swimming was not recommended outside a small netted enclosure. The warnings specifically mentioned box jellyfish and irukandji jellyfish, both potentially fatal. Kendrix read the signs and remarked that the warnings were meant to scare tourists. She said she had swum in tropical waters throughout Southeast Asia without incident, and that jellyfish stings were rarely serious. When her boyfriend suggested using the netted area, Kendrix said it looked crowded and unappealing. They set up towels roughly 200 feet south of the patrol station. As Kendrix walked toward the water outside the flagged zone, a surf lifesaver called out, instructing her to swim inside the designated area due to stinger risk. When she replied that she was an experienced swimmer, the lifesaver explained that box jellyfish had been sighted recently and that multiple stings had been reported over the previous week. He stated that patrol policy required directing swimmers back to shore during dangerous conditions. Kendrix became confrontational, saying she did not need supervision. She pulled out her phone and began recording, accusing the lifesaver of harassment. Other beachgoers paused to watch as the lifesaver calmly reiterated that box jellyfish stings could be fatal and that the netted enclosure was the only cleared area. Kendrix laughed, dismissed the warning, and said she would swim where she chose. The lifesaver radioed for backup and followed at a distance as Kendrix waded in and began swimming parallel to the beach, moving away from the netted zone against a light lateral current. Her boyfriend remained on shore. After several minutes, covering roughly 70 yards, Kendrix's swimming motion changed abruptly. She stopped making forward progress, her body stiffening before she began thrashing at the surface. Cries of distress were audible from shore, and 2 lifesavers entered the water immediately. They reached her within 90 seconds. Kendrix was floating face up, breathing rapidly, with extensive linear welts visible across her torso, arms, and legs, consistent with jellyfish tentacle contact. She was semi-conscious, moaning in pain, and unable to coordinate her movements. The lifesavers supported her and brought her to shore while radioing for vinegar. On the sand, vinegar was applied to inactivate remaining nematocysts. Welts covered roughly 30% of her upper body. Kendrix remained conscious but in severe distress, with rapid breathing and a markedly elevated heart rate. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes and initiated advanced life support. During transport to the nearest tertiary hospital, approximately 45 minutes away, Kendricks developed cardiac arrhythmias consistent with the cardiotoxic effects of box jellyfish venom. Despite antivenom administration and aggressive supportive care, Kendricks suffered complete cardiovascular collapse about 2 hours after the sting. Resuscitation attempts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead. Coronial findings determined that death resulted from cardiac arrest secondary to severe box jellyfish envenomation. Forensic analysis identified venom consistent with Chironex fleckeri, with sting patterns indicating contact across a large body surface area. Investigators concluded Surf Lifesavers followed proper protocols and that Kendricks had been repeatedly warned. Queensland authorities made no procedural changes, and the case was later incorporated into lifesaver training materials.
It was August 23, 2018, at a large outdoor event in a city plaza. The area had been set up with a temporary stage, lighting rigs, and crowd control barriers, and by mid-afternoon, the front viewing section was already full, with security actively managing the flow of attendees. Vienna Gail Stanton, who was 33, showed up after the crowd was already packed in pretty tight, like those rows of people just standing shoulder to shoulder near the stage. Right away, she starts working her way along the edge, trying to push in closer. Not in a subtle way either, she's slipping between gaps in the crowd, asking people to move, saying she can't see the stage, just repeating it over and over. From my observation, that kind of repeated pushing already sets the tone for how the crowd reacts to her. At first, a couple people actually respond to her, like they answer back or try to explain it's full, but it doesn't really go anywhere. After a bit, people just stop engaging with her altogether. They hold their spots, ignore the back and forth, and that front section just kind of locks in place. Security personnel noticed her repeated attempts to push toward the front and kept directing her back each time. The surrounding attendees followed the same pattern, no one made space, and every attempt was met with refusal, forcing her back into the denser middle of the crowd.
As time goes on, her frustration becomes more and more obvious. After several failed attempts and repeated redirections, she moves away from the main viewing line toward the side perimeter.
This area held temporary infrastructure lighting supports, staging equipment, and metal frames for cables clearly marked as restricted and not meant for public access, though less closely monitored than the main crowd control line. That side area feels a bit overlooked compared to the main crowd line. Vienna stops for a moment near one of the support structures, just watching the stage from the side, but her view is still pretty blocked from there. After a bit, she steps onto a low horizontal frame attached to the equipment setup. Then she climbs up again onto a higher section, basically using the structure to lift herself above the crowd so she can see better. People around her notice right away. A few start calling out for her to get down, clearly realizing she shouldn't be up there. Security staff quickly noticed the situation and began moving toward her position. At the same time, she continued along the structure, shifting her weight as she tried to stabilize herself while gaining a clearer view of the stage. The frame beneath her was not designed for foot traffic, and her movement caused uneven loading across the structure. That's the part she forgot to think about. As she repositioned again on the elevated frame, she lost her footing on the narrow, non-load rated surface. With no secure handholds and limited stable footing, she slipped and fell from the structure into the restricted equipment area below. Security and event staff reached her within moments, while emergency medical services were called to the scene. Responders arrived shortly after and took over care. She sustained fatal blunt force trauma from the fall, including multiple fractures and internal injuries consistent with a high-impact descent.
Despite resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced deceased at the scene.
The investigation determined that the lighting and support structure was not load rated for public access and was intended solely for staging equipment. It also concluded that repeated climbing and movement across the frame were contributing factors to the loss of stability. The final report noted crowd control pressure at the front as a contributing factor to crowd movement and frustration, but identified unauthorized access to restricted event infrastructure as the primary cause of the hazardous conditions in an active operational area. It was November 3rd, 2015, and a cold wind pushed low clouds across the eastern face of a mountain range in Argentine Patagonia, where a gravel parking lot at a trailhead sat mostly empty except for a park ranger's vehicle and a dusty silver SUV with Mendoza plates. Valentina Arriaga was 47 years old and worked as a civil engineer in Mendoza, Argentina. She was super fit and precise, kinda treated hiking the same way she treated her engineering work. Everything planned down to the detail and zero patience for anything that went off script. Her husband later said she had called the park office the day before to confirm the trail was open. They drove 5 hours specifically for this route and booked a hotel nearby. When they arrived at the trailhead and a ranger told them the trail was closed due to recent landslide activity, Valentina pulled out her phone and called the park's regional office from the parking lot while the ranger stood right there watching her do it. The call didn't change anything, but she stayed on it for almost 15 minutes trying to get someone higher up. Her husband said she was convinced the closure was basically a formality and that the trail itself was fine because she had researched conditions online the week before. I've been going back and forth on this one because on paper, she did everything right. She called ahead, drove 5 hours, had the whole thing planned out, and then reality didn't match and she just couldn't let it go. The ranger reiterated the closure and returned to his vehicle. Valentina and her husband continued past the barrier on foot. Her husband later said she was walking well ahead of him on the closed section, moving quickly with her phone out, checking a trail map she had downloaded before the trip. He said he called to her twice to slow down, but she didn't respond. The terrain around them showed pretty obvious signs of recent slide activity on both sides, like loose soil piled along the edges, displaced rocks sitting in the middle of the path, and broken timber all over the slope above. In a few places, the trail had partially washed out, leaving narrow sections where the footing was genuinely unstable. Roughly 40 minutes past the closure point, a saturated section of the slope above the trail gave way. The slide was not massive, but it was fast, carrying rock, loose mud, and broken timber across a span of roughly 30 feet of trail. The sound came first, her husband later said, a low cracking and then a rushing noise from the slope above that built-in volume, faster than he could process what it meant. Valentina was mid-stride when the leading edge of the debris reached her. She was swept roughly 15 feet downslope and partially buried under loose rock, soil, and a section of fallen timber. Her husband, roughly 60 feet behind, got knocked sideways by the outer edge of the slide, but somehow stayed above the surface. He crawled to where she was partially visible and basically just started trying to clear debris from around her head and chest with his bare hands. He called emergency services, but the signal was weak and the call dropped twice before it went through. Rescue teams reached the site on foot roughly 90 minutes later. She was extracted but had sustained catastrophic crush injuries to her torso and pelvis, and the weight of the debris on her chest had prevented her from breathing. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her husband was 60 feet behind her when it happened, and he cooperated with everything after, and I keep thinking about what that drive home alone must have been like for him. The trail remained closed for several additional months while stabilization work was completed. The park authority referenced the incident in updated closure enforcement policies and added physical gate barriers at high-risk trailheads. Her husband cooperated fully with the investigation. No legal action was filed. It was September 14, 2013 at a Castle Hotel in rural Scotland. The building mixed restored guest areas with older sections that were restricted due to decay and unsafe, sealed corridors. The guest was Lauren Ebio, a 6-year-old solo traveler who had spent months putting together her Scotland trip. She'd gone out of her way to book historic places instead of regular hotels because she loved the idea of staying somewhere that actually felt connected to the country's past. This castle was supposed to be one of the highlights of the trip. Lauren was also the kind of person who paid close attention to everything during a stay and wasn't shy about complaining when something bothered her. So when she kept hearing noise coming from restricted parts of the building, she got increasingly irritated. Staff repeatedly told her it was maintenance work in the older wings, but she never really bought that explanation. The way she saw it, if she was paying to stay in a castle, she should be able to experience all of it. The hotel was split into guest areas and restricted sections. Public spaces were reinforced, while older service corridors remained unstable with uneven steps, sealed drop-offs, and hidden shafts off-limits to guests. Signs and barriers marked the boundaries, and staff repeatedly warned visitors not to enter, noting these areas were unmaintained and could contain open drops. Lauren contacted reception several times about noise behind the walls and insisted she should have access to the whole property because of what she had paid for. Staff maintained the restricted wings were operational areas, not guest access. It reads like she didn't really accept that explanation, even after it was repeated more than once.
Later that evening, she left her room and moved beyond the main guest corridor into a side passage leading toward a service wing. A maintenance adjustment earlier in the day had left a partial gap at the entrance barrier. Inside, lighting dropped noticeably, and the floor changed from restored stone tile to uneven original masonry with gaps and signs of settling. The corridor narrowed as she went deeper, with more irregular stonework and areas showing incomplete or paused repairs leading toward a secondary junction. At the junction, she stepped onto a temporary covering panel placed over an old maintenance shaft. The panel had been partially unseated from its frame during earlier maintenance work and was not properly secured. It shifted under her weight and gave way, opening a vertical drop beneath the corridor. The fall dropped her directly into a deep service shaft within the castle foundation, with uneven stonework and exposed metal fixtures along the lower levels where maintenance infrastructure and structural supports were installed. Staff only realized that she was missing during routine room checks and when the door logs didn't quite match up. They went back through the internal records to track where she had gone, but getting to the shaft itself took time since it was down through maintenance routes and restricted corridors in the older, segmented parts of the building. Her body was recovered from the lower maintenance level. Injuries were consistent with a high-energy vertical fall onto uneven stone and structural fixtures in a confined vertical shaft environment. Medical findings listed the cause of death as traumatic injuries from a fall into a maintenance access shaft. Investigators found no failure of public safety systems, concluding that the incident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted service corridor. The final report determined that the area was clearly outside guest access zones and not intended for public use. After the investigation was completed, Lauren's remains were released to her family for repatriation. Following the incident, the hotel reinforced service corridor boundaries, installed permanent locking barriers, and updated guest signage throughout the property. It was May 30th, 2018, in a residential subdivision on the eastern edge of Lakeland, Florida. A woman who had spent years building a story about danger would become its ending. Dahlia Marie Rusk was 49. Now, in order to understand this story, I have to take you back to her childhood. She had grown up watching her uncle use stolen dogs as bait in fighting dog training sessions. And as an adult, she rescued one of that same breed, a pit bull that later bit her forearm badly enough to require surgery. She never owned another. What she kept instead was a long, compounding conviction about what those animals represented, and for weeks it had been directed at a neighbor 3 houses down who kept one behind a chain-link fence. She repeatedly confronted the owner whenever she saw him outside. Neighbors later described a pattern of tense exchanges that had become increasingly common over several weeks. Dahlia would stop while walking past the property, point out what she believed were signs of aggression, and argue that the dog was a threat to the neighborhood. The owner maintained that the animal remained secured inside the fenced yard and had never attacked anyone. The disagreements never escalated beyond verbal arguments, but they became a familiar sight on the block. Can you imagine how stressful it must be living in that area? Meanwhile, Dahlia's own dog, a medium-sized mixed breed, had a history of escaping through a warped gate she had repaired twice without fully correcting. That issue had persisted for some time without being fully resolved. Both situations existed side by side on the same street, and Dahlia had apparently decided only one of them was a problem. In her mind, one situation demanded attention, the other did not. That morning, Dahlia wrapped a piece of sausage containing over-the-counter rodent poison in a cloth and walked to the neighbor's fence. A security camera mounted on the neighbor's house with a clear view of the fence line captured her tossing it over the fence. The pit bull approached, sniffed it, and walked away. The dog showed interest only briefly before losing interest and moving on. Several hours later, her own dog, having slipped through the warped gate again, wandered onto the neighboring property, found the discarded sausage near the fence line, and ate it. By early afternoon, the dog was visibly ill. The bait she had left behind had poisoned it. Dahlia arrived at the neighbor's door with her dog, barely mobile, and accused him of poisoning it. He retrieved his phone and showed her footage from his own security camera, which had captured her near the fence earlier that morning. According to 3 neighbors who were outside or came to their doors, roughly 90 seconds of argument followed before Dahlia pushed through the fence gate and began striking the man, open-palmed first, then closed fist, connecting with his shoulder and the side of his head. What had started as a confrontation at the doorway had now become a physical altercation inside the yard. The pit bull, a 4-year-old male resting near the back fence, stood and became alert as the argument intensified.
After several more blows landed, the dog crossed the yard in under 3 seconds. Witnesses saw the contact. The first bite caught Dahlia's left forearm as she continued striking the owner. She did not stop. As the owner stumbled sideways and Dahlia lunged after him, her upper body pitched forward and exposed the right side of her neck. The dog's second contact reached her upper right shoulder. The third closed on the lateral neck near the jawline. I don't think a dog biting someone actively beating its owner requires much moral analysis. The owner placed a 911 call from inside the yard, while neighbors used a leash retrieved from the porch to pull the dog back. Responders arrived in 8 minutes. Dahlia was briefly conscious but unresponsive to questions. She died in transport. No cervical fractures were identified. Blood loss was the mechanism. Authorities reviewed security footage covering the gate and front portion of the yard, along with witness statements, within 24 hours, and determined that the dog had intervened only after Dahlia entered the property and repeatedly struck its owner. Investigators classified the behavior as defensive rather than unprovoked. The animal was not euthanized, and its owner was not charged. Dahlia's dog, treated at a veterinary emergency facility, also survived. The kind of harm Dahlia carried from childhood never announced itself clearly enough for her to address it, and that is the most straightforward tragedy in this entire story. It remained buried beneath years of habits, assumptions, and reactions, never presenting itself in a way she fully recognized. The damage was there, but not in a form she seemed able to identify or confront.
It was August 11th, 2018, and cool morning air carried a strong hydrogen sulfide odor across a geothermal field outside Reykjavik, Iceland. Steam rose from vents scattered across the barren volcanic landscape. Wooden boardwalks connected viewing platforms above active hot springs with rope barriers and warning signs marking designated safe pathways. Mirelle Ashford was 56 years old and owned an art gallery in Charleston, specializing in contemporary sculpture. She had traveled to Iceland with her husband for a 10-day landscape tour. Her husband later described her as intellectually condescending and dismissive of guides, often mocking organized tourism. They joined a small guided tour of the geothermal area. The group of 9 tourists was accompanied by a licensed guide with over 8 years of experience. The tour company operated under permits requiring visitors to remain on designated boardwalks. Before entry, the guide conducted a safety briefing, explaining that visible hot springs were fed by superheated groundwater with temperatures near boiling. He emphasized that the surrounding ground was unstable, consisting of thin crust layers covering scalding water and mud just inches below the surface. Rope barriers marked surveyed safe zones, while areas beyond contained unassessed vents capable of causing severe burns within seconds. As the group moved along the boardwalk, Mirelle repeatedly interrupted, stating the tour felt overly cautious and that barriers limited access to more interesting features. They stopped at a viewing platform overlooking a vivid blue pool ringed with white mineral deposits. Steam rose steadily from its surface. The platform stood about 15 feet back, separated by rope barriers and warning signs. The guide explained the pool's color resulted from suspended silica particles and reiterated that the ground beyond the barrier was unstable. Mirelle complained that the experience did not match promotional materials and said she had paid for authenticity, not to stand behind ropes. The guide repeated that the restrictions were mandatory. While the guide answered questions from other tourists, Mirelle walked along the boardwalk toward a section where the rope barrier was secured to a wooden post about 30 feet away. Her husband called after her. She paused, looked back at the guide, and stepped over the rope onto bare ground. Her husband shouted immediately. The guide ran toward her, ordering her to step back. Mirelle ignored him and walked slowly toward white, crusted earth that appeared solid, holding up her phone and narrating that she was accessing restricted areas. After approximately 20 feet, the ground beneath her right foot collapsed. Her leg plunged into scalding mud before she fell forward, breaking through the fragile crust with her hands and left leg. The surface gave way further, dropping her into a shallow depression filled with superheated mud and water. Her cries were immediate. The guide stopped at the barrier edge, radioing emergency services as steam rose from vents between his position and Mirelle, making a direct rescue unsafe. She attempted to push herself up, but sank deeper as the surrounding crust continued to crumble. When her husband moved toward the barrier, the guide restrained him, explaining specialized equipment was required. Geothermal rescue personnel arrived within 19 minutes, using rigid boards to distribute weight. They extracted Mirelle, who remained conscious but in severe distress. Her clothing was badly damaged by heat and mineral-rich water, and extensive burns covered her legs, arms, hands, and portions of her torso. A medical helicopter transported her to a hospital in Reykjavik. Despite aggressive burn management, her condition deteriorated over the next 16 hours, progressing to multi-organ failure. She was pronounced dead the following morning. Post-mortem findings determined that death resulted from multi-organ system failure, secondary to severe thermal burns covering approximately 40% of her body's surface area. Authorities concluded the tour company followed required safety protocols and that the guide's actions were appropriate. Video recovered from Mirelle's phone documented her barrier violation and the guide's warnings. Additional signage and higher barriers were later installed at the site.
It was June 19th, 2020, on a desert hiking trail in Arizona. The desert air was already shimmering under extreme midday heat, with exposed rock radiating stored warmth back into an atmosphere that offered almost no relief. Simone Blythe was 38 years old, a freelance bookkeeper working remotely across the Phoenix area. Recently relocated from Portland, she had limited experience with desert hiking in peak summer conditions, having only completed the trail twice during cooler months. Friends described her as independent and determined, and she'd been trying to re-establish a sense of autonomy after a long relationship ended.
Despite understanding Arizona's summer risks, she believed that she could manage a short afternoon hike with minimal supplies, and that belief is something to watch out for what she'll do next.
She arrived alone with a single bottle of water, light clothing, and no gear beyond sunscreen. An extreme heat advisory was active, with temperatures already exceeding safe limits for sustained exertion. At the trailhead, a park ranger explicitly warned her that conditions were dangerous, her water was insufficient, and a midday hike could quickly become life-threatening. At that point, she's already describing her own failure point before she even moves. Simone acknowledged the warning but brushed it off, insisting she would be fine on a short hike. When the ranger offered extra water and suggested she wait for cooler conditions, she refused and maintained that she understood her own limits. He warned her a second time, but she doubled down, insisting she'd hiked in similar heat before and that people tended to overreact to Arizona conditions. Even after one last attempt to stop her, she still went ahead and started down the trail alone. The trail was fully exposed, with sustained elevation gain and no meaningful shade, as heat radiated from the rock surface under direct sun. Within the first hour, her water supply became critically low, and continued exertion in extreme heat accelerated fluid loss and rising thermal strain, with early cognitive effects beginning to emerge.
Around an hour and a half into the hike, she finished her water, but continued forward despite worsening physiological strain.
Her core temperature rose as thermoregulation failed, and sweating became increasingly ineffective and inconsistent, marking heat stroke onset. She became disoriented, but did not turn back, continuing along the exposed ridgeline rather than towards safety. A brief emergency call attempt failed due to poor signal, and no follow-up was made. This is usually where it's not just the heat, it's running out of water that really pushes things over the edge. She eventually collapsed on the trail, dropping onto the sun-heated rock and losing consciousness within moments. A passing hiker came across her unresponsive, her skin extremely hot and dry signs consistent with severe heat stroke. Emergency services were called right away, and cooling efforts started on scene before continuing during transport. Despite aggressive medical intervention, her condition progressed to multi-organ failure due to extreme hyperthermia. She developed multi-organ failure, including kidney and liver injury, driven by systemic inflammation, cellular breakdown, and coagulation dysfunction. She briefly regained consciousness before deteriorating again and dying approximately 2 days after the initial collapse. The medical determination listed exertional heat stroke as the cause of death, with environmental exposure and insufficient hydration as primary contributing factors. Officials noted that survival in such conditions depends on rapid cooling and early recognition of cognitive decline, both of which were delayed by distance and timing. Her encounter with the ranger was later reviewed in updated park procedures for extreme heat advisories, reinforcing stricter warning protocols and support measures for hikers entering during high-temperature conditions. The incident contributed to a broader review of heat advisory procedures and updated hydration and warning protocols for extreme conditions. And what I keep coming back to is how early this could have ended, right at the trailhead, not out here on the ridge. It was August 19th, 2015, in the Vatnajökull region, Iceland. A marked tourist track ran along a glacier edge where summer thaw had already weakened surface stability, despite calm weather and clear visibility. Hannah Collins, 41, was an independent visitor relying on GPS navigation and downloaded maps rather than a guide. She was physically active and confident in outdoor environments, but she tended to dismiss warning systems when they conflicted with her planned schedule, often treating official route restrictions as overly conservative rather than necessary safety measures. Glacier terrain in the region changes daily as meltwater erodes internal ice structures, forming hidden voids beneath what appears to be stable snow. Warning signs clearly advised staying on marked routes, but she used it to justify leaving the marked route for a shorter crossing across an open ice field, despite clear signage advising against off-route travel. Despite visible signage and direct warnings from a distant guide team, she chose to proceed, arguing the marked route was unnecessarily indirect. She left the official path and moved onto the open ice field. At first, the surface appeared firm, but subtle changes began underfoot, snow compressing into quieter, denser ice. Small fractures forming, but they didn't automatically spread. She slowed briefly, acknowledged the surface change, then moved on anyway. Something I would read as a moment where most people would stop, but she continued past it. As she moved forward, she stepped into a wider, slightly sunken area, later identified as a collapsed melt pocket. The ice here was thinner than the surrounding surface, kinda just a weak crust over a hollow channel underneath. A faint cracking sound started under her steps, spreading out in uneven patterns. Within seconds, the surface gave way beneath her. The ice failed along weakened fracture lines, breaking into irregular slabs as the thin surface layer collapsed into a concealed melt channel filled with icy water and broken ice fragments. The failure propagated locally across adjacent unsupported sections as weight shifted onto structurally compromised ice. She attempted to brace against the edges, but the ice kept breaking under pressure. The collapse expanded outward as structural stress redistributed across weakened ice, causing adjacent unsupported sections to fracture and fail in sequence. Subsurface melt channels contributed to instability by reducing structural integrity beneath the surface layer. A lot of it moves faster than people expect up close. Not a clean single break, but in those uneven failures that keep spreading while you're still trying to react to the first one. A nearby guide team saw the collapse from a distance and immediately radioed emergency services while heading toward the site across unstable terrain. But the fractured ice field kept spreading in unpredictable ways, so they had to move slowly and carefully. Rescue responders arrived following a delayed overland response, reaching the collapse zone within tens of minutes due to the proximity of guide teams and coordinated glacier rescue units already operating in the region. Recovery efforts found her in a submerged channel beneath fractured slabs, where exposure to freezing water and sustained injury had already led to fatal hypothermia and trauma. Death resulted from a combination of traumatic injury sustained during the ice collapse and rapid cold water immersion, leading to immediate cold shock, respiratory failure, and drowning in the submerged channel. The official investigation found no external mechanical trigger and confirmed that the glacier failure was consistent with known subsurface melt void behavior. Contributing factors included deliberate deviation from marked routes and disregard of posted hazard signage and guide warnings, despite repeated indications of unsafe surface conditions leading to misjudgment of surface stability. The shortcut area was permanently closed after surveys revealed extensive hidden melt cavities beneath terrain that had appeared stable from above. I thought the surface would hold long enough to turn back when I needed to. It was October 9th, 2014, and a thin afternoon rain had turned the unpaved surface of a mountain pass road in the Peruvian highlands into a slick ribbon of red-brown mud where the road cut across a slope at roughly 12,000 feet, with no guardrail and a drop of several hundred feet on the outside edge. Deirdre Stallworth was 52 years old and worked as a corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm in Denver, Colorado. Super precise, super controlled, and pretty much always the most prepared person in whatever room she walked into. She had planned this whole solo driving tour of the Peruvian highlands herself, with routes mapped out, hotels booked, rental car reserved, weeks ahead of time. The employee at the rental counter later said Deirdre had overruled his route suggestion before he even finished the sentence, told him she had driven mountain roads in the Swiss Alps, and that she didn't need a local driver. When he continued to recommend a different vehicle with better clearance for the mountain roads, she asked to speak with his manager. She left the counter in the sedan she originally booked. The rental guy said he had made the same recommendation to dozens of clients before, and most of them just said okay and took the driver, but she looked at him like he had insulted her intelligence, and that's the detail from this whole story I keep coming back to, because he was a 20-something kid at a rental counter genuinely trying to keep a stranger alive, and she treated him like he was wasting her time. The road she chose was a known high-risk route with a history of vehicle accidents, especially during rainy season when the unpaved surface turned to loose mud and gravel. The switchbacks narrowed to a single lane in places with sheer drops on the outside and no guardrails or barriers of any kind. Locals who used the road regularly knew to honk before blind curves and pull to the inside when passing. By early afternoon, rain had been falling for over an hour, and the surface was honestly getting worse with every vehicle that came through. Tire ruts from earlier traffic had filled with muddy water, making it basically impossible to tell solid ground from soft spots. Deirdre was traveling alone on a switchback section when the vehicle's outside wheels lost traction on wet gravel. The sedan's low clearance and standard road tires had no grip on the slick surface. The vehicle lost traction entering the curve and began sliding toward the outside edge of the road. She appeared to have tried to correct. Investigators found evidence of hard steering input and braking, but on the loose, wet surface, the correction only made the slide worse. The rear wheels went over first, and the vehicle just tipped, rolling multiple times down the steep slope and dropping several hundred feet before it came to rest against a rocky outcropping. The cabin was pretty much completely deformed from the impacts. A passing truck driver spotted the fresh tire marks and damaged road edge roughly an hour later and pulled over to look down the slope. He could see the vehicle far below against the rocks. He contacted local authorities by radio. Rescue teams hiked down to the vehicle, which honestly took over an hour just because of how steep it was. Deirdre was found inside, still partially held by the seatbelt. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be multi-system blunt force trauma consistent with a prolonged vehicle rollover down a steep grade, with injuries to the head, chest, and extremities. The vehicle showed no mechanical failure. The cause was entirely environmental and driver-related. The rental company added seasonal restrictions on certain mountain routes and expanded written hazard disclosures in its agreements. The specific route was flagged going forward with a required acknowledgement signature. Her law firm put out a brief statement. The rental employee's recommendation and her refusal were both documented in the incident file. It was August 2nd, 2015, on Lake Lanier, Georgia. You wouldn't think a woman who spent 20 years handing down rulings could be undone by something as simple as a kayak and a few feet of water, but that's exactly what was waiting for her. Tessa Latasha Jefferson was 55 years old and had spent the better part of 2 decades telling other people what the rules were. She had served as a family court judge in a mid-sized Georgia county until her removal 3 years prior following a corruption investigation involving payments from several local waterfront business interests. She had not returned to law in any formal capacity since. She lived alone on a lakefront property she had owned for 11 years, and by the summer of 2015, her primary occupation appeared to be monitoring the water in front of her dock. A family of 4 had been kayaking in the area that morning, 2 adults and 2 children on recreational craft. They were moving slowly through the water, maintaining a calm pace as they passed within the shared public area near the shoreline. When they drifted within approximately 40 feet of Tessa's dock, she appeared on it and demanded they leave. Her reaction came immediately once she noticed their proximity to her property line. They did not leave immediately, which was within their legal right in a public waterway, and they continued to drift at a controlled pace. She called the local Marine Authority dispatch. That call is documented in the official record and logged at the time it was made.
Now, what happened next is not something anyone would have recommended. After waiting roughly 10 minutes without seeing a response from authorities, Tessa pulled a recreational kayak from beside her dock, dragged it to the edge, and lowered it into the water.
The family watched from roughly 60 feet away. One adult member described her movements as fast and stiff, the kind of motion that belongs to someone acting before they've finished deciding. Tessa was wearing sandals, capri pants, and a short-sleeved shirt. She was not wearing a life jacket. The kayak she had placed in the water was a flat-bottomed, sit-inside recreational model, the kind sold at large retail chains and rated for calm, flat water with a seated, balanced entry. It was not secured to the dock. Nothing was holding it in place as she prepared to board. She stepped into it feet first from a standing position on the dock's edge. That is not how you board a kayak. It is one of the easiest ways to lose balance because the boat can move independently beneath you the moment your weight shifts. The hull rolled the moment her weight transferred. Family members described the motion as immediate and total, not a wobble, but a full rotation. There was no gradual tipping and no opportunity to correct it. Her feet went left and the boat went right, and there was no recovery because there was no moment between the step and the capsize. The entire sequence unfolded almost instantly. Her left side struck the edge of the dock at hip and shoulder height as she went down. Her head contacted the dock's outer frame on the way into the water. The family paddled toward her immediately. One adult entered the water and pulled her to the surface. She was unresponsive. Although none of them had formal CPR training, they attempted basic life-saving measures while another family member called emergency services. Marine unit responders arrived approximately 11 minutes later. She was transported to a nearby medical facility, where she was later pronounced dead. The coroner determined she died from drowning, complicated by blunt head trauma consistent with impact against a wooden dock edge. The head contact likely caused immediate disorientation or incapacitation that prevented her from recovering once she entered the water. She did not drown fighting, she did not drown aware.
In the days following, witnesses noted that the same family Tessa had been trying to remove from the water had gone in after her without hesitation.
Their statements described a rapid, instinctive response rather than a delayed decision, with multiple witnesses noting that there was no pause before they entered the water. The same individuals who had been on the receiving end of the earlier confrontation acted immediately once the situation changed. Too bad the dock edge didn't care about her credentials, her rulings, or anything she believed gave her authority over that water. It was May 14th, 2022, at a mid-sized retail store inside a shopping complex in suburban California. The store was operating under normal customer traffic, with staff rotating between floor assistants, inventory checks, and backroom restocking duties. Joan Revell was a 60-year-old woman who had just gone to the store looking for one of those household storage items they had on sale. She lived nearby, just in a residential area not far from there. People who knew her later kind of described her as someone who didn't really like waiting around, especially in stores. If something wasn't available right away, she'd get impatient pretty quickly. She didn't have any background in how retail or stockrooms actually work, but she usually trusted her own judgment more than whatever staff were telling her. And that detail alone already shows where the tension starts building. On that day, Joan approached a sales associate asking for a specific item. The employee checked the inventory system and explained it was no longer on the sales floor and would only be available after a scheduled restock. She was offered alternatives and given standard restock information, but she rejected the explanation and kept insisting staff to check inventory, despite being told that it had already been verified.
As the exchange went on, her frustration grew. She raised her voice, drawing attention from nearby customers.
And when the employee stepped away briefly to consult a supervisor, Joan moved toward a staff-only door leading into the stockroom. With the area momentarily unattended amid floor activity, she pushed through before anyone could stop her. Inside the stockroom, it was tight and kind of chaotic narrow aisles. Pallets stacked up, cartons still being staged, shrink-wrapped goods everywhere, and staff actually working with equipment moving around. I've seen enough of these spaces to know they're not built for hesitation or wandering around. Joan kept moving deeper into the stockroom, calling out as she scanned the shelves for the item. While passing through a staging area, she leaned against a pallet that had not yet been fully secured during active restocking. The contact seemed minor, but it shifted the load enough to destabilize part of the stack. Several cartons fell first, followed by a larger shift as the pallet tilted into adjacent inventory. The instability spread through the storage section, causing part of a shelving bay and multiple palletized loads to collapse into the narrow aisle. Joan was struck by the falling inventory and trapped beneath a large volume of merchandise and palletized goods. The collapse left her pinned with severe crushing injuries and unable to free herself. Employees responded immediately after hearing the collapse and called emergency services, but the fallen inventory had created a large entrapment zone while surrounding pallets remained unstable. The weight of the collapsed loads and the confined stockroom layout complicated rescue efforts, requiring responders to secure the area before reaching her. With unstable inventory around the collapse zone, I could see staff could only secure the area and wait for responders.
After access was gained, Joanne was pronounced deceased at the scene due to catastrophic crushing injuries sustained during the collapse.
The investigation determined that Joan's unauthorized entry into the restricted stockroom and disturbance of staged inventory led to the collapse. No charges were filed against the store, and the incident was classified as a preventable accident caused by entering a restricted operational area.
It was July 14, 2016, and humid afternoon air hung over a private villa spa in Ubud, Bali. Steam rose from heated stones on bamboo shelves as eucalyptus oil drifted through open pavilion walls. Palm fronds rustled above the treatment room. Bryn Castleman was 42 years old and worked as a regional vice president for a pharmaceutical sales company in Chicago. She had traveled to Bali with 2 friends for a wellness retreat. Friends later described her as dismissive toward service workers and someone who believed her professional status entitled her to special treatment. The spa offered a traditional deep tissue treatment using heated stones and sustained pressure. The service required health screening as prolonged heat and intensive manipulation carried risks for individuals with cardiovascular conditions or those taking blood pressure or anticoagulant medications. The intake form asked about recent heart procedures, prescriptions, and medical history. Bryn had undergone cardiac catheterization 4 months earlier and took anticoagulant medication daily. She left the cardiovascular section blank and marked no beside questions related to heart conditions and recent procedures. The spa technician reviewed the form and began verbal screening, asking directly about heart conditions and recent medical interventions. Bryn interrupted, stating the questions were unnecessary. The technician explained that the treatment involved sustained heat that could affect circulation, making certain conditions unsafe. Bryn raised her voice, asking if she was being accused of lying. She pulled out her phone and began recording, stating loudly that she was being refused service after paying premium rates. She demanded a manager and threatened negative reviews on multiple platforms. The technician apologized and offered a modified treatment using lower heat and reduced pressure. Bryn refused any modifications, insisting she had paid for the full service. She continued recording while criticizing the technician's professionalism and refusing to acknowledge written safety warnings. After several minutes of escalating confrontation, the technician agreed to proceed with the standard protocol. The treatment began around 3 in the afternoon. Heated stones, typically maintained between 120 and 130 degrees, were positioned along Bryn's spine. The technician applied sustained pressure while the stones remained in place, periodically repositioning them according to standard sequencing. Bryn lay face down, partially draped, and did not voice discomfort during the early portion of the session. Restricted airflow within the open pavilion allowed heat to build, elevating the ambient room temperature. Approximately 20 minutes into the session, the technician noticed irregular breathing and reduced chest movement. Bryn's skin appeared unusually flushed, and perspiration had increased beyond what was typical for the treatment. When spoken to, she did not respond or move. The technician immediately removed the stones and checked for responsiveness. Bryn remained unresponsive, with a weak, rapid pulse detected at her wrist. Villa staff called emergency services, while guests tried to cool her by removing linens and fanning air. Paramedics arrived about 18 minutes later and transported her to a nearby private hospital. But despite continued resuscitation, she went into cardiac arrest roughly 40 minutes after arrival and could not be revived. The medical examiner ruled the death an acute myocardial infarction complicated by heat stress and underlying coronary disease. Toxicology showed only prescribed medications. Investigators found she falsified the intake form and ignored repeated safety warnings. The spa faced no penalties and later discontinued heated stone services after authorities reviewed the case.
It was July 8, 2014 in Queensland, Australia. A reef flat near a coastal stretch was exposed at low tide, revealing broad coral platforms that appeared stable under clear morning skies, though conditions were already shifting faster than forecast. The couple were Emma Clark, 29, and Daniel Hughes, 31, visiting Australia on a short leisure trip. Emma was a freelance lifestyle content creator trying to grow her travel social media work, while Daniel worked in corporate marketing and generally preferred following local guidance when traveling. Earlier in the trip, Emma had become increasingly frustrated with what she saw as excessive rules and restrictions at tourist destinations. She often complained that staff exaggerated risks and limited access to places people had traveled thousands of miles to see. Daniel usually avoided arguments and often went along with her decisions even when he disagreed. That morning, warning signs and local staff advised visitors to begin returning before the incoming tide window. Daniel suggested heading back once water started creeping into the lower channels, but Emma insisted they still had plenty of time for photos and dismissed the warnings as overly cautious. I've noticed a lot of people wait until they can actually see the water moving before they start heading back. As they continued farther across the reef, the incoming tide accelerated through lower channels not visible from their position. Daniel suggested turning back when some of their earlier crossings began disappearing underwater, but Emma pushed on, convinced they could still make it back without a problem. They only attempted to return once water movement became impossible to ignore. By then, the coral surface was coated in a thin film of seawater and algae, making it highly slippery. Daniel moved ahead, trying to find the safest route back to shore while urging Emma to follow, but a surge of incoming water cut through a connecting channel between them, isolating them on separate sections of reef. Within minutes, the exposed platform turned into broken coral pockets, with water moving rapidly through them. As conditions worsened, Daniel attempted to cross toward Emma rather than continue toward a safer route alone. He stepped into a submerged tidal channel where the reef dropped into deeper water. A surge pushed him sideways through the reef system as the current intensified. Emma attempted to move toward him, but the widening channels and incoming water made it impossible. Witnesses from higher ground contacted emergency services after observing both individuals being cut off by widening water channels. A nearby coastal guide issued a radio alert, and response teams were deployed by vessel and shoreline access shortly after notification, with initial assets reaching the reef perimeter within approximately 20 minutes, depending on launch conditions and coastal access points.
Even from above, it's hard to tell how fast the channels are linking until the crossings you just used stopped being crossings at all. I've seen how quickly that shift happens on this kind of reef, and it's always faster than it looks from a distance.
Rescue crews recovered Daniel's body first from a submerged coral trench where water movement had trapped him against uneven rock formations. Emma was later found farther along a connected channel, partially submerged in deeper water where currents had intensified. Both died from drowning after becoming trapped by rapidly rising water that overtook the reef flat and cut off their return route. Medical findings listed the cause of death as drowning due to tidal entrapment, with contributing coral abrasions and blunt trauma sustained while being swept across shallow reef structures. Investigators confirmed that tidal conditions were within expected ranges, but advanced faster than they appeared at reef level. The report concluded that the couple had remained beyond the recommended turnaround point despite visible warnings, delaying their return until safe crossings were already disappearing. Daniel's attempt to reach Emma after they became separated further exposed him to the strongest tidal channels. The site was later upgraded with elevated exits and automated tide warning systems to reduce similar incidents. It was May 27, 2015, in New Braunfels, Texas. Low crossings were running fast and brown after 2 days of heavy rain, with floodwater cutting across normally familiar rural terrain. Stellar Roderick was 52 years old, a substitute teacher in a local school district. She was known for being practical, self-reliant, and resistant to caution she viewed as exaggerated, shaped by years of living on rural property and navigating seasonal flooding without incident. Her confidence in reading water conditions was based on past experience rather than updated safety knowledge. And over time, that experience had hardened into certainty about risk. She believed she could visually judge. She was heading home after helping a neighbor move livestock when she came up on a road closure, barricades, warning signs, and a couple of utility workers standing near a flooded stretch of road. That's the first warning sign to go back. They told her there was a downed power line in the water and that it still wasn't safe to go through. The water didn't look that deep, but it was dangerous because of the electricity in it. Even after they warned her a few times, she went around the barrier anyway and walked into the flooded area toward where the line was. And that is just unsettling. Everything's clearly set up and warned, but she still treats it like it doesn't really apply to her.
Unbeknownst to her, the downed line was already energizing the floodwater, creating an uneven electrical field that dispersed through the water and the surrounding ground.
As she moved forward, she repeatedly bridged points of differing voltage, exposing herself to an increasing step potential risk. By the time she went farther into the flooded section, the electrical difference in the water around her had built up enough to become lethal. On her next step, her legs essentially completed a path for the current through her body, and the shock hit almost instantly through her lower body and chest. Her heart likely went into ventricular fibrillation within seconds, cutting off normal function immediately. She dropped straight into the floodwater without any real struggle or sound. I didn't expect it to be that immediate, one step, and it's already over. Rescue attempts began almost immediately from outside the energized zone. Utility personnel were unable to enter the water due to live current risk and initiated coordination for circuit isolation while attempting to reach her with tools and lines, but distance and conditions prevented contact. Power was eventually isolated at the substation within several minutes, followed by field verification of de-energization before responders entered and retrieved her. She had already been submerged for an extended period, with no cardiac activity upon recovery. CPR was initiated and continued through transport, but she did not regain vital signs.
A medical examination determined death by electrocution due to contact with energized floodwater.
External injuries were minimal, with small electrical burn patterns consistent with electrical contact, though entry and exit points were not definitively localized due to immersion conditions. Internally, her heart showed no prior disease, and death was attributed entirely to electrical disruption of cardiac rhythm. The report noted that the hazard was not visually detectable and that standard warnings and barriers were present at the site. Her belongings were later returned to the family. A handwritten note found during the estate clearing referenced a prior flood season and a reminder to check water levels before crossing the road. It was kept by her daughter. A procedural update was later introduced by the utility company requiring documentation when civilians refused safety instructions at active electrical hazard scenes. No public statement was issued regarding the specific incident that led to the change. It was October 11, 2016, at a two-story apartment complex on the eastern edge of Tucson, Arizona. A dispute between neighbors had been building there for weeks. Kendra Mott was 44 years old and had spent most of her professional life managing residential properties across Pima County. She was seemingly efficient, organized, and by most outward indicators, good at her job until an audit 3 years prior revealed a pattern of withheld security deposits, falsified damage claims, and redirected maintenance funds. She lost her license and her position within the same week. By 2016, she was renting a second-floor unit at the same type of complex she had once managed, and the inversion appeared to have done something to her sense of proportion. I think what happened to Kendra is a case study in what unresolved humiliation does to a person's judgment over time. Neighbors described her as prone to complaints and quick to escalate. She had filed 4 noise grievances against the couple in the unit directly below hers in the preceding 6 weeks alone. The couple below her, a man and woman in their late 20s, had received formal notices about the complaints and had disputed each one. There were no citations issued. The property's management had begun documenting the conflict from both sides. What Kendra had interpreted as deliberate provocation based from a television, a door closing at 11 at night, was, by all available evidence, ordinary residential life. But her framework for the situation had already calcified. She probably had decided they were doing it on purpose, and that decision made everything that followed feel, to her, justified.
At some point that evening, she retrieved a cinder block from a shared utility area near the rear of the complex, a standard construction block, roughly 35 pounds, which had been left beside an unused storage shed for months.
It was heavy and solid enough to require both hands just to lift and carry it with any control. Ring camera footage from a unit directly across from the stairwell with a clear view of the upper landing captured her carrying it up the exterior stairwell at 9:47 p.m., moving steadily without hesitation. Her pace did not slow, and she did not adjust her grip as she climbed. She stopped on the upper landing between the couple's front door and the large window beside it. The footage showed her raising the block above her head with both arms. She was standing less than 3 feet from the window frame, holding the block high above her head. The block stayed elevated as she positioned herself directly in front of the glass. She looked ready to bring it down directly into the window.
What the footage couldn't have prepared anyone for was what came next. The front door opened inward from the inside.
The male resident, who later told responding officers he had heard something scraping on the landing, pulled the door open without any awareness of what was on the other side. He shouted the word was unclear on the audio, but the volume was not. Kendra's arms were already extended overhead. The startle response was immediate and total. The block slipped from her grip and dropped awkwardly against her lower leg before crashing across the top of her right foot. She screamed. Her weight shifted backward in a single uncontrolled motion. The landing behind her was a narrow concrete platform bordered by a waist-high guardrail. As she stumbled backward, the back of her legs struck the rail. Her upper body continued over it. The momentum carried her up and over before she could recover. She pitched over the guardrail and fell into the stairwell below. The camera captured the descent partially. Investigators counted contact with 3 separate stair edges and the lower wall before she came to rest at the base of the stairwell. The resident called emergency services within seconds. Responders arrived in approximately 5 minutes. The coroner's findings described acute subdural hematoma and diffuse axonal injury consistent with repeated blunt cranial trauma across multiple impact points. She was pronounced dead at a regional medical center later that night. Police reviewed the ring footage, cross-referenced the witness statement, and closed the investigation as an accidental fall during an attempted act of vandalism. No charges were filed. I'm totally with the investigation results, but it being right still makes me think that it's the most uncomfortable part of this entire thing. It was January 7th, 2017, and the late morning sun was already pushing temperatures into the low 90s along a popular stretch of urban beach in a coastal city in northeastern Brazil, where red warning flags snapped in the onshore wind at intervals along the sand, and a lifeguard station sat on an elevated wooden platform near the main access point. Iracema Cavalcanti was 54 years old and had spent her entire career as a school administrator in the same coastal city, retiring 2 years earlier after nearly 3 decades in the public education system. Since retirement, she had basically built her whole morning routine around the beach. Same spot every day, same towel placement, same umbrella angle, same time of arrival. Her daughter later said Iracema referred to the beach as hers, and she genuinely wasn't joking when she said it. She acted like the stretch of sand in front of her umbrella was basically her personal property. She was known for arguing over seating at nearby cafes and had once spent 10 minutes at a breakfast counter insisting a family move so she could have the table she considered hers. That's kind of the thing with people like this, right? They don't back down because nobody ever makes them back down. And after enough years of getting their way, I genuinely think they just stop believing the rules apply to them. That morning, Iracema arrived at her usual time and found red flags posted along the beach with conditions marked as dangerous. A lifeguard, a man in his early 20s who had been working the station for about 2 years, approached her near the waterline and warned her not to enter the water due to strong rip currents. Iracema told him she had been swimming at this beach since before he was born, basically said the flags were for tourists who didn't know the water. The lifeguard repeated the warning and asked her to stay on the sand. She just waved him off and walked into the surf without looking back. She waded past knee depth, then waist depth, moving with the kind of confidence that kinda only comes from doing something 1,000 times without anything going wrong. The lifeguard watched from the shoreline, whistle in hand. Another beachgoer who saw the whole thing said she literally didn't even glance back at him. Within roughly 2 minutes of entering the water, a rip current caught her at chest depth and began pulling her past the break line. She went from standing to struggling in seconds. Her arms came up, but her body was already moving sideways and out. The lifeguard entered the water immediately, sprinting from the sand into the surf. By the time he reached the area where she had been standing, she was already roughly 40 feet offshore. He swam toward her, but the current pushed him off her line. A second lifeguard launched a rescue board from the station and paddled out. They reached her roughly 6 minutes after she entered the water. She was face down and unresponsive. They pulled her onto the board and brought her back to shore. CPR was started on the beach by the lifeguard team. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. Resuscitation continued for over 30 minutes. She was pronounced dead on the beach. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be drowning, with the rip current documented as the direct mechanism. The lifeguard did everything right here, warned her, went in after her, put his own safety on the line for someone who had just dismissed him to his face, and it still wasn't enough. And honestly, I keep wondering how he moves past that. The lifeguard was cleared in the investigation. The beach authority expanded signage along that stretch and added a second staffed station for high-risk conditions. Irasema's daughter gave a brief statement to local media where she pretty much described her mother as someone who just never believed anything bad could happen to her at her own beach. It was October 3rd, 2018, near Mount Etna in Sicily, Italy, where access to active volcanic terrain was managed through designated viewing areas and temporary safety boundaries. The visitor was Elowin Kade, 34, an American tourist on a long-planned trip through Italy. Visiting Mount Etna had been the highlight of the trip, and I can understand why. Mount Etna is one of those places people build an entire trip around. She had spent months planning around it. After investing so much time, money, and effort into reaching the volcano, she viewed any restriction or delay as something standing between her and the experience she felt she had earned. The hike to the viewing area was more demanding than she expected. By the time she finally arrived, she was tired, frustrated, and already irritated by the wind-blown volcanic ash and dust that kept coating her clothes, camera equipment, and phone screen. After spending so much effort getting there, she felt entitled to enjoy the view on her own terms. The designated viewing area overlooked active volcanic terrain surrounded by unstable ash-covered slopes, active steam vents, and restricted hazard zones. Temporary rope lines and marked boundaries separated visitors from areas where footing could quickly become hazardous. As conditions changed, guides and park officials began moving visitors farther back from the viewing area and expanding the safety perimeter. Most visitors complied, but Elowin immediately pushed back. She argued with staff, complained that the restrictions kept changing, and insisted the ash wasn't dangerous enough to justify moving everyone. Witnesses later recalled her repeatedly asking why she had spent hours getting there, only to be told to move farther away the moment she arrived. Honestly, she sounded more annoyed at the rules than the actual environment at that point. Rather than leave, Elowin stayed behind, arguing with staff and filming videos criticizing the restrictions. Staff reminded her several times to remain behind the barriers, but she kept returning to the same restricted area after each interaction. As ash continued to accumulate across exposed surfaces, Elowin stepped beyond a temporary rope boundary to get a wider shot for her audience. Witnesses later said she appeared more focused on filming and arguing her point than paying attention to where she was standing. She kept repeating the same actions, stepping, repositioning, adjusting the camera again and again. Watching the sequence afterward, I got the impression that her attention had shifted almost entirely to the video and away from where she was actually standing. When she shifted her weight on the ash-covered slope beyond the rope boundary, the loose volcanic ash provided almost no traction. Her footing slipped forward, and she lost balance, dropping over the barrier onto the steep embankment below. The steep slope and loose ash made it impossible for her to stop. She continued sliding downhill, unable to regain her footing as the unstable surface carried her deeper into a restricted volcanic zone beyond the viewing area. As the slide continued, she entered terrain marked off due to volcanic hazards. Witnesses later reported seeing her disappear into an area broken by fractured lava formations, unstable ground, and active steam vents. Rescue teams eventually located Elowin within the restricted volcanic zone and transported her to a nearby hospital in critical condition. Despite emergency treatment, she died from a combination of traumatic injuries sustained during the slide and severe thermal injuries caused by exposure to active steam vents within the restricted volcanic area. Investigators found no failure of barriers, warning systems, or park procedures. The investigation determined that repeated disregard of safety warnings led her into the restricted area, with loose volcanic ash ultimately causing the slip that triggered the accident. Following the incident, officials increased on-site monitoring during periods of elevated volcanic activity, reinforced temporary safety boundaries, and expanded visitor briefings regarding the hazards posed by unstable volcanic terrain and restricted volcanic areas. It was February 8, 2014, in Halstead Bay on Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. The sky was a flat white overcast, and the frozen lake stretched outward in uneven shades of gray where snow, pressure cracks, and wind-scoured ice blurred distance across the bay. Zariah Aldenor was 41 years old, working as a dental hygienist in a private clinic in a suburban medical district. Coworkers described her as confident to the point of confrontation, often correcting others with certainty, even outside her expertise. She had ice fished as a child but had not done so in years, and her understanding of lake ice was based on memory rather than current safety knowledge. She arrived at the public access with a 14-year-old neighbor's son and no safety gear beyond winter clothing. Although local advisories warned that ice beyond the nearshore zone was unpredictably thin over the deep channel, and a conservation officer repeated that warning in person, Zariah dismissed it as overcautious pointed to another fisherman farther out as proof the ice was fine, and walked onto the lake anyway.
She's already past the shoreline here, and the officer is probably watching her feet more than her face.
The officer approached her twice and warned that the area ahead contained dangerously thin ice. Zoraya dismissed the warning, pointed to fishermen farther out on the lake, and insisted the officer was exaggerating the danger, which is scary to think of, especially she's bringing a kid with her. When he repeated the warning and told her not to go out there, she got more confrontational, even questioning his competence and saying she had been on ice like this before without any issues. The officer made it clear he couldn't physically stop her, but strongly advised her to turn back. Zoraya dismissed him again and stepped onto the ice while the teenager stayed on shore.
About 200 yards out, she reached the area above the submerged channel where the ice suddenly got much thinner.
It gave way without warning, breaking open under her weight. She fell into near-freezing water and immediately went into cold shock, gasping uncontrollably and involuntarily pulling water in. Her winter clothes soaked through and pulled her down. She came back up briefly and grabbed at the ice edge, but it kept breaking under her grip. Her movements started getting unsteady as the exposure worsened. She went under again, resurfaced slightly away from the original break, and kept struggling against ice that was too thin to hold her. That alone is a scary experience, not just for her, but for the teenager as well. The teenager on shore witnessed her hands pressing against the underside of the ice before they stopped moving. Emergency responders from a county water rescue unit arrived within half an hour, but unstable conditions delayed access onto the ice. When divers were finally deployed, they located her beneath the surface, carried laterally by a weak current under the ice sheet. Resuscitation was initiated on scene and continued during transport to a regional hospital, but she did not regain vital signs and was pronounced dead later that morning. A medical examination determined drowning due to cold water immersion. Injuries to her hand showed severe abrasions and torn nails, consistent with repeated attempts to pull herself onto failing ice. Findings indicated rapid incapacitation consistent with cold shock response, and officials noted that survival time in those conditions without flotation support would have been extremely limited, making timely rescue unlikely. The teenager was not publicly named and withdrew from school for a period following the incident. Years later, he contributed to ice safety awareness efforts at public access points around the lake, focusing on improved warnings and safety education.
It was March 21st, 2018, when afternoon sun blazed over turquoise waters off Koh Samui, Thailand. A tour boat rocked gently near the outer edge of a buoyed reef zone, with coral formations visible beneath the surface as tourists prepared for the afternoon snorkeling session. Jessa Thormond was 38 years old and operated a lifestyle brand producing travel content for thousands of followers. She had arrived in Thailand on a content creation trip, booking excursions specifically for filming. Former collaborators later described her as someone who dismissed safety protocols as obstacles to dramatic footage and treated guides as assistants rather than authorities. The snorkeling excursion carried 13 tourists and 2 staff members, led by a certified instructor. The reef lay within a protected marine zone, marked by floating buoys anchored roughly 80 yards apart, forming a designated swimming area intended to keep guests away from strong currents near the reef's drop-off. Before entry, the instructor conducted a safety briefing, explaining that swimmers were required to remain inside the buoyed area due to intensified currents beyond the boundary. He referenced prior incidents and emphasized he would remain in the water to assist anyone who struggled. Jessa asked to swim outside the marked area to photograph coral near the reef edge. The instructor refused, explaining that currents beyond the boundary had pulled swimmers into deeper water, and that company policy prohibited leaving the zone. Jessa argued that her snorkeling experience made the restriction excessive, holding up her waterproof phone case and saying she needed angles unavailable from the tourist area. The instructor repeated his refusal and warned that leaving the zone would require her return to the boat. The group entered the water around 2:30. The instructor floated near the center of the swimming area as guests adjusted masks and fins. Jessa swam away from the group almost immediately, heading toward the far boundary with strong strokes. She reached the buoy line within minutes. The instructor called out and signaled for her to return. Witnesses later reported that Jessa acknowledged the signal but continued swimming, briefly submerging as she passed beyond the buoy while holding her camera rig. The instructor pursued her as Jessa surfaced intermittently but continued outward, filming beneath the surface. She moved roughly 40 yards beyond the boundary, reaching the point where the reef dropped sharply and the water darkened. According to the instructor's statement, Jessa appeared to recognize the current's pull when she attempted to turn back. Her movements slowed and became less coordinated as she tried to make headway. The instructor reached her with a flotation aid, but she resisted while still holding her camera. Her breathing became rapid and uneven. The instructor grasped her arm and signaled the boat operator. Jessa pulled away, swallowing water and coughing as she shifted from horizontal to vertical, struggling to keep her head above the surface. The instructor secured the flotation device under her arms, but her panic escalated. She thrashed violently, striking him and briefly pulling him underwater. When he resurfaced, Jessa had submerged. He dove immediately, locating her 5 to 6 feet below the surface with her snorkel flooded. The boat reached their position within 90 seconds. Crew members pulled Jessa aboard, finding her unresponsive and not breathing. CPR was initiated immediately as the boat returned toward shore, where an ambulance was waiting. Paramedics worked for more than 30 minutes attempting resuscitation. Jessa was transported to a nearby medical facility and pronounced dead approximately 1 hour after the incident. Findings later determined that death resulted from drowning due to seawater aspiration. Thai maritime authorities interviewed passengers and crew, finding the instructor's actions consistent with rescue protocols. Recovered phone footage showed Jessa swimming beyond the boundary and filming until moments before she struggled. The tourism board later mandated additional buoy signage warning of dangerous currents.
It was February 18th, 2016, and morning sunlight hit the surface of a glacial river in Chile's Lake District, where it cut through a steep-walled gorge lined with mossy rock and overhanging southern beech trees, the water running a milky blue-green from snowmelt and moving fast enough to hear from the put-in point above. Gemma Thornycroft was 29 years old and worked as a PR coordinator for a mid-size firm in Bristol, England. She was several months into a long trip through South America with a friend, and the rafting was a last-minute addition booked the night before at a hostel. Her friend later said Gemma pretty much treated safety demonstrations the way most people treat terms and conditions on an app, something to sit through so the actual experience could start. During the pre-launch safety briefing, the guide spent about 10 minutes going through what to do if you fall out of the raft, keep your feet downstream, arms crossed over your chest. Do not try to stand up in the current because your foot can get trapped between rocks underwater. Gemma appeared distracted through most of it, checking her phone a couple times and barely looking at the guide. At one point, she leaned over to her friend and said something that made her friend laugh, and the guide noticed and paused and asked her directly if she had any questions. She told him she was good. 10 minutes of briefing and one body position is all that separated her from walking away from that river, and she couldn't be bothered to look up long enough to hear it? That's what I can't get past. The group launched on a section of river rated Class 3 to Class 4. The first 2 sets of rapids went fine, and Gemma honestly seemed like she was having a good time from what everyone said. A larger hydraulic feature at the base of a drop caught the front of the raft and kicked the bow upward sharply. Gemma was seated in the front left position, the most exposed seat on the raft, and was thrown forward and out. She entered the water headfirst and surfaced roughly 10 feet downstream. She did not assume the recovery position she had been shown. She was upright in the current, arms flailing, legs pointing downward instead of forward, which is basically the worst possible position to be in. Her left foot lodged between 2 submerged rocks beneath the surface. The current immediately pinned her body face down with her foot anchored below. The force of the water against her back made it basically impossible for her to lift her head. The guide entered the water within seconds and reached her position, but the current was pinning her with so much force he could not rotate her body or free her foot. A second rafter climbed onto a rock downstream and tried to reach her from a different angle, but the water between them was too fast and deep to cross safely. By the time a throw rope was secured to a tree upstream and enough leverage applied to shift her position and dislodge her foot, she had been submerged face down for several minutes. CPR was started immediately on a rock shelf beside the river. Emergency services were contacted by satellite phone. A rescue team reached the gorge within about 45 minutes. Resuscitation efforts continued, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination later determined the cause of death to be drowning, with foot entrapment in a submerged rock formation documented as the contributing mechanism. Investigators noted that the feet downstream recovery position covered in the briefing is specifically designed to prevent the type of entrapment that occurred. If her feet had been forward and near the surface instead of dangling below her, the entrapment pretty much would not have happened. The rafting company reviewed its safety procedures and added a verbal confirmation step, where each participant had to repeat the recovery position back to the guide before launch. The guide was cleared of all fault. Gemma's friend gave her statement and went back to England. A selfie they took on the raft like 10 minutes before the rapid was still on Gemma's phone when they found it in her dry bag.
It was November 23, 2017, and thin morning air surrounded ancient stone terraces in the Peruvian Andes. Clouds drifted through valleys below as sunlight illuminated weathered granite structures. Tour groups moved along designated paths marked with rope barriers. Celeste Havering was 54 years old and worked as a residential real estate developer in Orange County. She had traveled to Peru with her husband on a guided historical tour. Her husband later described her as someone who viewed rules as suggestions and responded aggressively when denied access. The group of 12 tourists was led by a licensed guide with over a decade of experience. Heavy rainfall in the weeks prior had caused erosion and instability in unreinforced areas, prompting site management to expand restricted zones with rope barriers and multilingual warning signs. Before entering the site, the guide explained that certain areas were closed due to weather-related instability and that violating barriers could result in removal and penalties under Peruvian law. Around mid-morning, the group reached a stone terrace overlooking ruins descending toward a river valley. An orange rope barrier blocked access to a narrow platform along the cliff edge, with signs warning the area was unstable. Celeste questioned why photographs were not allowed from the platform. The guide explained erosion had undermined support beneath the terrace, and that engineers determined it could not safely bear weight. Celeste responded that she had paid more than standard tours and expected full access. The guide reiterated that no operator was permitted to enter closed zones and that his license prohibited barrier violations. Celeste raised her voice, accusing him of ruining her vacation, and began recording him on her phone while other tourists watched. While the guide remained with the group, continuing his explanation, Celeste walked briskly toward a different section of barrier, approximately 40 feet away, where the rope was anchored to a fixed post. She glanced back toward the guide, who was facing away while addressing other tourists, and stepped over the rope. Her husband called out, but she waved him off and walked onto the stone surface. She moved toward the outer edge of the platform and raised her phone to take a selfie, positioning herself near a visible crack where the stone met the underlying soil. According to multiple witnesses, the surface appeared intact underfoot, but as Celeste shifted her weight forward, the compromised substrate failed without warning. The stone slab fractured along a weakened seam, and a section measuring approximately 6 feet across separated from the main platform. Celeste dropped vertically for roughly 25 feet before striking a lower stone wall shoulder first. The impact caused her body to rotate, after which she tumbled an additional 30 feet down the terrace slope, striking multiple stone edges before coming to rest on a lower landing. The guide radioed emergency services as nearby tourists shouted for help. Rescue personnel reached the location within 25 minutes, using climbing equipment and restricted service paths to access the site. Celeste showed no signs of life when rescuers arrived and was pronounced dead at the scene. Examination later determined that death resulted from severe traumatic brain injury, including skull and cervical spine fractures, along with multiple fractures and internal organ damage consistent with a fall onto stone surfaces. Site management provided maintenance records documenting the area's closure, and witness statements from 11 tourists confirmed the guide's warnings and Celeste's deliberate barrier violation. Authorities classified the death as accidental with contributory negligence, and the barrier system was later reinforced with additional signage and physical supports.
It was July 18th, 2019, during a prolonged heat wave in central Texas. Temperatures had stayed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days, and even after sunset, the air remained heavy and uncomfortable across the city. Pamela Joy Coltrix was 42, and she lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a pretty average residential complex. She worked from home, so she was there most of the time, and that week especially, she'd just been stuck dealing with the heat day after day. It was one of those stretches where it doesn't really cool down, even at night, and according to neighbors, she was getting more and more frustrated about it. They said she'd been complaining a lot, not just about the temperature, but about the building in general. She'd often argue with management too, and she had this way of seeing the rules like they were just there to make things harder for tenants, like they didn't really have a good reason behind them. The apartment building used a centrally controlled air conditioning system. In an effort to reduce electricity costs during overnight hours, management had implemented scheduled reductions that limited cooling output after midnight. Pam was furious about it. It's already been building up around her for a while. It makes me feel like the argument wasn't just one bad day.
Over several days, she kept complaining that the landlord was stealing air conditioning that tenants were already paying for.
Staff explained the system was still running and only slightly reduced overnight for energy savings during the heat wave, but she dismissed it as excuses. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she was that she was being personally cheated. Just outside her second-floor window was a large commercial AC condenser serving part of the building. It was part of the cooling system, but it actually pushed heat out as it ran. Still, she fixated on it as if being near it meant being closer to the building's cooling itself. It's literally right outside her window, which makes that fixation a lot more immediate. At some point that evening, she decided on an unusual solution. If the apartment itself wasn't going to be cold enough, she would go directly to the equipment she believed was producing the cooling. Shortly after midnight, she opened her bedroom window and climbed onto the exterior ledge. From there, she attempted to reach the air conditioning condenser mounted just outside the wall, which really sounds absurd to hear. The equipment was never designed to support a person's weight. Its sheet metal casing offered almost no secure footing, and the constant vibration from the compressor made balance difficult even before movement began. Despite that, she continued, a brief metallic sound echoed through the exterior wall, followed by a shout. As she tried to adjust her position on the unit, she lost her footing on the unstable surface. During the fall, she reached for a nearby electrical conduit fixed to the building wall, trying to slow or stop herself. The conduit immediately failed under the sudden load, either bending sharply or tearing free from its mounting points. With nothing left to hold onto, she fell roughly 1 story onto the concrete below. The impact caused a fatal head injury and extensive blunt force trauma. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found her unresponsive. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no indication of foul play or mechanical failure, and the physical evidence was consistent with an accidental fall from exterior building equipment.
Following the incident, apartment management installed additional window restrictors and warning notices near units overlooking exterior mechanical equipment.
Residents were also reminded that the building's cooling infrastructure was not designed for public access under any circumstances.